The start of an ordinary day. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the city as the afternoon progressed. It was the kind of day that wrapped everything in a comforting embrace, the kind of day that made you want to linger outside just a little longer, breathing in the fresh air, soaking up the last bits of daylight. People walked slowly along the sidewalks, savoring the peaceful rhythm of the moment. A soft breeze rustled the leaves in the trees, adding to the calming soundtrack of the neighborhood. On the corner of Maple Street, just across from the small park, sat an 8-year-old girl named Amina. Her wheelchair was positioned carefully on the sidewalk, her arms resting on the soft blue handles as she watched the world go by. She had spent the last few hours playing in the park with her friends, enjoying every second of it. The laughter, the chase, the freedom of simply running with the wind. Amina embraced it all with the same enthusiasm as any other child. She wasn't defined by her wheelchair. To her, it was just part of her everyday life. There was so much more to Amina than the chair that she sat in. Today, she had been particularly happy. The sun was warm, and the air was filled with the scents of fresh grass and blooming flowers. The simple joy of spending time with her friends, her voice ringing with laughter, was enough to make her forget about the challenges she sometimes faced. She was the same as every other child on the playground, her wheelchair no more significant than the color of her shoes or the clothes she wore. She was a child, and that's all she wanted to be. Now, sitting alone on the sidewalk after her friends had left to go home for the evening, Amina took a moment to rest. She was catching her breath, gazing at the setting sun and the gentle sway of the trees. The world was still, and for those few moments, it felt as though time had paused just for her. There were no worries, no fear, just the simple happiness that comes from feeling free and alive. Her mind wandered as she thought about the rest of the evening. Maybe she would get some ice cream after dinner or spend some time with her father. She loved when they played chess together. Even though she had trouble with the physical aspects of the game, her father was always patient with her, teaching her new strategies and helping her think several moves ahead. It was one of those little rituals that made life feel complete. But just as Amina was about to push herself forward in her chair and head home, she noticed something unusual in the distance. A faint sound, at first almost unnoticeable, grew louder. The faint hum of a vehicle on the street soon became the unmistakable screech of tires and the blaring sound of a police siren. It wasn't just any siren. It was loud, urgent, as though something serious was about to unfold. Amina's heart fluttered in her chest. She had seen police cars around the neighborhood before, but she had never been this close to one. There was a lingering unease that settled in her stomach. She watched as the flashing red and blue lights drew nearer. The sound of the siren grew louder with each passing second, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The patrol car came to a screeching halt a few feet away from her. The sound of the tires grinding to a stop seemed too sharp, too quick, too harsh for a peaceful afternoon. The vehicle's engine sputtered a few times before dying, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The officer inside was taking his time, shifting in his seat, adjusting his hat, and slowly stepping out of the car. Amina watched his every movement, her body instinctively tense, her senses on high alert. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his police uniform stiff and clean. But what struck Amina most was his face, the hard, cold expression he wore as he scanned the area. His eyes locked onto hers for the briefest moment, a chill running through her body, as she tried to make sense of what was happening. What did he want with her? She hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't even seen him before. She was just sitting here, minding her own business, enjoying the peace of the afternoon. And yet, here he was. Amina couldn't move. She sat frozen in her chair, her heart racing, a mix of fear and confusion swirling in her chest. Why was he walking towards her? She glanced around desperately, searching for anyone who might be nearby, someone who could help. But the sidewalk was eerily quiet now. The few people who had been walking earlier had disappeared, and the distant sound of cars seemed muffled against the growing tension in the air. Without warning, the officer approached her. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, the sound of his boots on the concrete growing louder with each step. Amina's fingers gripped the armrests of her wheelchair as she instinctively tried to shrink into herself. She could feel the weight of his gaze, heavy and judgmental, pressing down on her. The officer stopped just a few feet away from her, standing tall and imposing. He didn't smile, didn't speak kindly, just looked down at her with a gaze that made her feel small, insignificant. Amina's breath caught in her throat as she instinctively pulled her arms closer to her body. The officer's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, a cold smirk that sent a shiver down her spine. "You're coming with me," he said gruffly, his voice harsh and commanding. Amina's eyes widened, her chest tightening with panic. I didn't do anything," she stammered, her voice trembling. "What do you mean? Why do you want me to come with you?" But the officer didn't respond. His eyes, cold and unyielding, never left her face. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what she was doing here. He didn't care to know. The officer just grabbed the handles of Amina's wheelchair, his grip firm, almost too forceful. She winced slightly as he jerked the wheelchair forward, the wheel scraping against the concrete. His rough touch made her heart race with fear. "I said, you're coming with me," he repeated, his voice growing even colder. "But please, I didn't do anything wrong," Amina pleaded, her voice catching in her throat. Her small hands reached out to hold onto the chair, desperate to stop him. She looked around again, hoping that someone, anyone, would help, but there was no one there. The street was eerily silent, and she felt completely alone. The officer wasn't listening to her. He was already pushing the wheelchair towards his squad car, his expression never changing. It was as though he had already made up his mind about her, without knowing anything at all. "Why are you doing this?" Amina whimpered, but the officer didn't answer. His grip on the wheelchair tightened, his face set in stone. What could Amina, an 8-year-old girl, have possibly done to deserve this? The thought echoed in her mind, but there was no answer, just the cold, unfeeling presence of the officer. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the next. The world seemed to move in slow motion as she was pushed across the sidewalk, her body trembling. What had just started as a simple, peaceful day was now turning into a nightmare, and Amina couldn't understand why. The unseen father. As Amina's world was rapidly spiraling into confusion and fear, a sudden shift occurred. A sense of unease that seemed to ripple through the air as a shadow appeared in the distance. Captain Benjamin, Amina's father, had been responding to a call not too far from the scene. His duty as a police officer had placed him a few blocks away from his daughter, but fate had conspired to bring him here, at this exact moment. Benjamin was no stranger to the weight of his work. As a captain in the police force, he had spent over 20 years serving his community. He had seen the darkest corners of human nature, yet he had always tried to uphold justice, to serve with honor and protect the innocent. The badge he wore, polished and proud, symbolized years of dedication, years of standing for what was right. But nothing in his career could have prepared him for what he was about to see. It started with a feeling, a twinge of something in the air, something amiss, something wrong. Benjamin had been deep in conversation with a fellow officer when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of sirens. He paused, his instincts kicking in immediately. The sound of that siren, so familiar, yet in that moment, it felt different. His mind raced as he stood still for a moment, taking in his surroundings. Something was out of place. He looked up, his gaze shifting to the streets ahead, trying to pinpoint the source of the urgency in the air. And then, through the distance, his sharp eyes spotted something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car that froze him in place. It was the sight of his daughter. Amina. She was sitting there in her wheelchair, her small frame rigid with fear, her wide eyes locked on the officer who was manhandling her chair. Benjamin's heart thudded in his chest as a deep sense of panic surged through him. For a split second, his mind raced to understand what was happening, what he was seeing. But one thing became crystal clear. His little girl was in trouble, and he couldn't allow it. His thoughts were a blur as he rushed toward the scene. The heavy, rhythmic pounding of his footsteps echoed in his ears, drowned by the noise of his racing heart. His body moved faster than his mind could process, and soon he was almost there, almost within reach of Amina. He could see the officer now, his expression rigid and cold, pushing Amina's wheelchair with a roughness that caused Benjamin's blood to boil. His daughter was crying, her face streaked with tears, and his protective instincts kicked in like a tidal wave. His muscles tensed, his jaw clenched, and all he could think about was reaching her. But he knew better than to react impulsively. He had been a cop long enough to understand how quickly things could escalate. The last thing he wanted was for the situation to get any worse. He forced himself to breathe deeply, to stay composed, even as every ounce of his fatherly instinct screamed at him to confront this officer. "Excuse me, officer," Benjamin called out, his voice steady, but filled with an authority that couldn't be ignored. The officer didn't even look up. His gaze remained fixed on Amina, not even sparing a second to acknowledge the interruption. Benjamin's patience began to wear thin, but he knew he had to stay calm. The officer had to know he wasn't just anyone. He wasn't just a bystander or a random citizen. He was a police captain, and this was his daughter. "Excuse me," Benjamin repeated, this time with more force. "What's going on here?" The officer didn't flinch. He continued to move Amina's wheelchair forward, as though Benjamin's words meant nothing. "I'm handling police business," the officer muttered, his voice cold and dismissive. The words stung Benjamin like a slap to the face. His daughter, innocent and helpless, was being dragged through this ordeal, and this officer was treating it like it was just another routine assignment. Benjamin felt his anger bubble to the surface, but he pushed it down, refusing to let it control him. He couldn't afford to lose his composure, not now. "I'm talking to you," Benjamin said again, his voice firm and commanding. This time, the officer looked up, his eyes meeting Benjamin's. There was a brief flicker of hesitation in his gaze, but it was quickly replaced with a defensive glare. The officer stepped forward slightly, attempting to stand his ground. "What's your problem?" The officer barked, clearly annoyed by the interruption. Benjamin's eyes narrowed. He knew the officer didn't recognize him, didn't know who he was. It wasn't uncommon for police officers to overlook each other's identities, especially in a city with so many officers on duty. But Benjamin wasn't just any officer. He had served with distinction for years. He had earned his rank, earned his respect. And now, this officer was making a mistake that could cost him more than he realized. Benjamin stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. He didn't flinch, didn't back down. His voice was low but firm as he said, "I'm Captain Benjamin. This is my daughter." The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on the officer. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. The officer's eyes flicked nervously from Benjamin's face to Amina's tear-streaked one, and then back again. It was as if he was seeing the situation for the first time. The truth began to settle in. The realization that he had just made a monumental mistake. The officer's face lost its bravado, his expression faltering as he stammered, "She's your daughter." Benjamin didn't wait for the officer to finish his sentence. The anger that had been building inside him couldn't be contained anymore. He stepped forward, his voice rising in intensity. "Yes, she is my daughter," Benjamin said, his eyes flashing with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "And you thought she was a criminal. You thought an 8-year-old girl in a wheelchair was a threat. What kind of officer does that? What kind of person does that?" The officer took a step back, his face paling as he realized the magnitude of his actions. He had assumed the worst based on nothing more than the color of Amina's skin, and now that reality was staring him in the face. The pride and arrogance he had carried with him moments before had disappeared, replaced by a clear sense of regret and a fear of the consequences he was about to face. Benjamin's voice grew louder, his anger evident. You didn't even care to ask her name. You didn't care to ask her why she was sitting here. All you saw was a black girl in a wheelchair, and that was enough for you to treat her like a criminal. How dare you? The officer, visibly shaken now, glanced around at the gathering crowd. Benjamin wasn't the only one who was upset. People had stopped to watch, to witness the injustice unfolding before them. Phones were out, recording every moment, ensuring that what was happening would not be forgotten. Benjamin's eyes never left the officer's face. You didn't know she was my daughter, and now you have to deal with the consequences. But I want you to understand something, he said, his voice now colder than the officer's. This isn't just about me. It's about the system. It's about people who make assumptions based on nothing but prejudice, and that's something I will not stand for. The officer stammered, his face flushing red. He mumbled something about not knowing, about not realizing who Amina was, but Benjamin wasn't interested in excuses. He wasn't interested in apologies that came too late. You didn't care enough to ask, Benjamin said, his voice sharp. You didn't care enough to treat her like a person. You only saw her skin, and that's where you went wrong. The officer now shifted nervously, the weight of his mistake becoming clear. Benjamin pulled out his phone, his movements deliberate. What's your badge number? He demanded, the edge in his voice unmistakable. The officer hesitated, but Benjamin's glare was enough to push him into compliance. Slowly, the officer muttered his badge number, and Benjamin took note of it, snapping a photo of the officer's badge for future reference. As the officer stood there, humiliated and unsure of what to do next, Benjamin turned his attention back to his daughter. He knelt beside her, his hand gently brushing away her tears. You're safe now, sweetheart, Benjamin whispered, his voice softening as he spoke to his daughter. Amina looked up at him, her eyes wide and filled with confusion, but there was a flicker of relief there too. She reached out and squeezed her father's hand, her voice quiet but steady. I was scared, Daddy, she said. Benjamin's heart ached for her. He knew the fear she had felt. He had felt it too, but he was determined to make sure that fear didn't define her. He was going to fight for her innocence, and fight for a world where no child had to endure the cruelty that Amina had faced today. A father's fury. The air felt heavy as Captain Benjamin knelt beside Amina, his protective gaze never leaving the officer who had made such a grievous mistake. His blood boiled, not just because his daughter had been mistreated, but because of the cold and calculated manner in which the officer had decided that an innocent 8-year-old girl, confined to a wheelchair, was a criminal. As Benjamin's fingers gently brushed through Amina's hair, his mind raced, each thought sharpening his sense of fury. He had seen corruption and injustice in his years on the force, but never before had it come so personally. Never before had someone so directly threatened what was most precious to him. His daughter, his pride and joy, had been terrified, confused, and humiliated. She hadn't just been arrested, she had been targeted because of the color of her skin. It wasn't lost on him that it wasn't just Amina who had suffered today. It was every person who had been stereotyped, racially profiled, and made to feel inferior simply because of their background or the way they looked. Benjamin's chest tightened as he looked down at his daughter, her trembling hands still clutched at the armrests of her wheelchair. Her tears had stopped for the moment, but the fear in her eyes hadn't completely faded. He could see it, the tremor in her body that wouldn't go away. She had been shaken to her core, and the damage done was not something that would easily disappear. The scars of this experience would linger far longer than the bruises ever would. He looked back at the officer, who was now standing awkwardly a few feet away. His face was pale, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. The officer was caught in a web of his own making, and the realization of what he had done was settling in. But Benjamin knew that the officer's remorse, if it even truly existed, wouldn't undo the damage he had caused. This wasn't a simple mistake that could be swept under the rug. It was a moment of cruelty, rooted in prejudice, that had traumatized a child. The officer's hand was still hovering near his sidearm, as if unsure whether to move it or not. He was shifting nervously, avoiding eye contact with Benjamin, fully aware of how badly he had misjudged the situation. Yet there was no hint of accountability in his posture. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't even acknowledging the depth of his wrongdoing. His voice trembled as he spoke. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to. Benjamin's voice cut through the officer's stammering. "You didn't mean to. You didn't know. You thought that my daughter, an 8-year-old in a wheelchair, was a criminal, that she was some kind of threat to society." His words were laced with venom now, each sentence sharper than the last. "How does that happen, officer? How does that happen when you've sworn an oath to protect and serve?" The officer remained silent, his shoulders hunched in defeat. He had no defense. How could he? His actions were indefensible. He had made assumptions based purely on Amina's race, an innocent child, just sitting on the sidewalk, doing nothing but enjoying a moment of peace, and he had treated her like she was a criminal. Benjamin stood up slowly, towering over the officer, his presence imposing and unwavering. "What gives you the right?" he asked, his voice quieter, but filled with fury. "What gives you the right to decide who deserves dignity, who deserves respect, based on nothing but the color of their skin?" His words were like a hammer, each syllable pounding into the officer's soul. "Do you know how many innocent people have been hurt by that same logic? How many lives have been ruined because people like you decide who's worth protecting and who isn't?" The officer's gaze dropped to the ground, unable to meet Benjamin's eyes. He had no words, no justification for what he had done. Benjamin could see that he was overwhelmed, cornered by his own ignorance. But that didn't matter now. What mattered was Amina, his daughter's safety, her well-being, and the promise he had made to always protect her. He wasn't going to let this go. Turning back to Amina, Benjamin gently placed his hands on her shoulders, trying to ground her, trying to offer her comfort amid the chaos. "You're safe now, sweetheart," he whispered. But his own heart was heavy, torn by the injustice that had unfolded. "I promise you, nothing like this will ever happen again." Amina looked up at her father, her small face still streaked with tears, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and confusion. "Daddy, why did he do that to me?" she asked, her voice small and fragile. The words broke Benjamin's heart. How could he explain to his daughter, his innocent little girl, the cruelty that people were capable of? How could he tell her that there were people in this world who judged her before they even took the time to know her? Benjamin leaned down, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "Because there are some people, sweetie, who see the world through a lens of hate. They're afraid of what's different. They don't understand that everyone deserves respect, no matter what they look like, no matter where they come from. And sometimes they make mistakes, big mistakes." But Amina, wise beyond her years, didn't seem to understand. Her gaze shifted to the officer, still standing there awkwardly, his hands wringing in front of him. "But I didn't do anything wrong," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. Benjamin sighed deeply, his heart aching for her. "I know, baby. I know." He turned back to the officer, whose nervousness had given way to discomfort as he stood under the weight of Benjamin's judgment. There was a brief moment of silence, an almost unbearable tension hanging in the air. The officer's face was red now, his throat dry, sweat gathering at his brow. He knew the consequences of his actions were far from over, and it wasn't just about this one encounter, it was about the larger system he was a part of. Benjamin wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to walk away from this without ensuring that something changed. This was about accountability. This was about making sure that no other child had to endure what Amina had suffered. "You're going to face consequences for this," Benjamin said, his voice low but laced with conviction. "I'm filing a formal complaint. I'm not going to let you walk away from this." Not without facing the damage you've caused." The officer swallowed hard, his face paling further. "Please, I didn't know. I didn't mean to. I didn't know she was your daughter." His words were weak, pleading, but they fell on deaf ears. Benjamin wasn't interested in apologies now. He wasn't interested in excuses. All that mattered was that this officer's actions were a clear violation of what it meant to be a public servant, and Benjamin would not rest until there was justice for his daughter. "You didn't know because you didn't care enough to ask," Benjamin shot back, his anger flaring again. "You only saw a black girl in a wheelchair, and you assumed the worst. You didn't see a child. You didn't see an innocent soul. You saw a stereotype. And that's the problem." The officer stood there in stunned silence, his previous bravado completely gone. The gravity of his actions was sinking in, and the crowd had begun to take notice. People who had been watching from a distance, too afraid to intervene, were now standing with their phones out, capturing the moment. They were making sure that what had happened wouldn't be forgotten, that the officer's mistake wouldn't be swept under the rug. Benjamin had become their voice, the voice of countless people who had suffered because of the same biases the officer had acted upon. Benjamin turned back to his daughter, kneeling down to her level once more. "We're going to make sure nothing like this ever happens again," he said softly, taking her small hands in his. "You're going to be okay, Amina. I promise." As he wheeled her away from the scene, the crowd parted, some clapping in support, some shaking their heads in disbelief at what had just unfolded. The officer stood there, humiliated, watching them leave with a sense of guilt that would haunt him for a long time. But for Benjamin, this was just the beginning. He would fight for Amina's peace of mind, for the peace of mind of every child who had ever been unfairly treated because of their skin color. This moment, this fury, would fuel his resolve for the battle ahead. The call for accountability. As Captain Benjamin wheeled Amina down the sidewalk, away from the officer and the scene of the injustice, the weight of what had happened began to settle in. The soft click of the wheelchair's wheels against the pavement was the only sound that filled the air, and for a moment, everything felt strangely quiet. But beneath the surface of that stillness, Benjamin's mind was racing, the anger still simmering inside him. His thoughts moved faster than his legs could carry them, a constant stream of questions swirling through his head. How could this have happened? How could an officer, sworn to protect, have been so quick to judge an innocent child? And why did it feel like no one cared about the damage that had been done? Benjamin focused on Amina, who sat silently in her wheelchair. Her small face was turned downward, her eyes avoiding his gaze, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The tremors in her body had subsided slightly, but the silence that hung between them spoke volumes. The fear she had felt earlier still lingered in the quiet, and Benjamin's heart broke all over again. He wished he could shield her from the world, from the prejudice and hatred that people sometimes carried within them. But more than that, he wished he could simply take away the memory of what had just happened. He couldn't undo the terror she had felt, and that thought gnawed at him. "Sweetheart," he said softly, trying to break the silence. "Are you okay?" Amina looked up at him, her eyes wide and soft, yet there was something else there now. Something Benjamin had never seen before in her, a vulnerability that struck him to his core. She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated, as if she wasn't sure how to put her feelings into words. Instead, she just shook her head slightly, the weight of her silence louder than any words she could have said. Benjamin swallowed the lump in his throat. He had been prepared for many things as a father, but not this kind of pain. He had sworn to protect his family with everything he had, but here he was, watching his own daughter suffer. "I'm sorry you had to go through this, Amina," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted you to experience something like this. No child should ever have to deal with hate or prejudice, and no one should ever make you feel less than because of the way you look." Amina looked at him again, her small, innocent eyes searching his face for some kind of comfort. Benjamin smiled gently, trying to reassure her despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "We're going to fix this," he promised, more to himself than to her. "I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. You're not alone in this." But even as he spoke the words, Benjamin knew this wasn't just a promise to his daughter. It was a vow to every child, every person who had been judged unfairly, every life that had been ruined because of assumptions like the one made today. This wasn't just about Amina anymore. It was about something much larger, something that went beyond one officer's mistake. As they turned the corner, moving farther away from the scene, Benjamin's thoughts became laser-focused. The wheels in his mind began to turn, moving from the raw emotion of the moment to the practicalities of what needed to happen next. What was the first step? What could he do to hold this officer accountable, to make sure this never happened again? The answer was simple: action. Benjamin knew that in his position, he had a responsibility, not just to Amina, but to everyone who had ever been unfairly treated by the system. He couldn't simply let this go. He couldn't let the officer's negligence be swept under the rug as so many others had been. He had seen it before: the pattern of bias, the mistreatment of minorities, the way prejudice was often dismissed as a misunderstanding rather than an intentional act of harm. He had worked for years alongside officers who had respected their badge, who had worn it proudly and justly. But he had also seen the dark side of the force, the officers who misused their power, who let their biases cloud their judgment. And today, he had witnessed it firsthand. It wasn't enough to simply be upset about it. Benjamin needed to take action. He knew the system, the way it operated, the way things could so easily be dismissed with the right connections or the right apologies. But that wasn't the way he operated, not anymore. If he was going to make real change, he would have to go through every channel. He would have to fight not only for Amina, but for all the children who had been mistreated and misunderstood. He would have to be the voice for those who had been silenced by prejudice. As they neared the end of the block, Benjamin reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. His hand shook slightly as he dialed the number of his superior, the one person who could help him start the process. He knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be pushback, there would be excuses, and there would be those who would try to defend the officer's actions. But Benjamin wasn't going to back down. Not now. The phone rang once, then twice, before his superior answered, his voice calm but professional. "Captain Benjamin, how can I help you?" Benjamin took a deep breath before speaking. "I need to file a formal complaint. I need to report an officer for misconduct. There's been an incident." The words came out smoothly, but inside, Benjamin's heart was pounding. This wasn't just another complaint. This was an incident that had violated everything he stood for, everything he had dedicated his career to. "There's been an arrest," he continued, his voice now hard and unwavering. "An 8-year-old girl was wrongfully detained in a wheelchair. She's my daughter." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, followed by a sharp intake of breath. Benjamin could hear his superior processing the information, the shock and disbelief settling in. He wasn't surprised. No one ever expected something like this to happen, not to them, not to anyone they knew. "I understand," his superior finally said. "I'll start the process immediately, but you know this isn't going to be easy. We'll need all the evidence we can gather, and there will be an internal investigation. Are you sure about this?" Benjamin didn't hesitate. "I'm sure," he said firmly. "I'm not backing down. This officer needs to be held accountable. I'm going to make sure of it." His superior sighed heavily, but there was a note of respect in his voice. "All right, Captain. We'll begin the paperwork, and I'll have the investigation started right away. But you need to know, this won't be quick. It's going to take time." Benjamin nodded, but the weight of the words didn't settle in his chest. He had no intention of letting time be an excuse for inaction. "I understand," he replied, "but this needs to happen. Not tomorrow, not next week. It needs to start now." He hung up the phone, his heart still heavy, but now filled with a sense of purpose. As he looked at Amina, who was still staring at the ground, lost in her thoughts, he felt a surge of determination. He had a plan. He had a mission. And it was bigger than just one officer. It was about making sure this moment, this injustice, was never forgotten, that it would never be repeated. He wheeled Amina down the street with newfound resolve. The path ahead would be difficult. The fight for accountability wouldn't be easy, and the road would be long. But he wasn't going to rest until justice was served. Not for him, not for Amina, but for every person who had ever suffered because of bias and discrimination. And with that thought, Benjamin promised himself something. He promised that he would not let this moment slip into the background, not like so many others had before. This time, he would make sure that people remembered the name of the officer who had abused his power. And more importantly, he would make sure that people remembered the name of the girl who had been wronged. Amina, his daughter, the little girl who had been forced to face a world full of prejudice far too early, but who would grow up stronger, wiser, and more determined than anyone could have ever imagined. A legacy of strength. The day after the competition, Samuel woke up with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. His muscles ached from the previous day's efforts, but the feeling wasn't one of exhaustion. It was one of pride. He had shown up, given everything he had, and more importantly, he had done it for himself. The competition wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It had been a test of his own strength, discipline, and resolve. And in that test, he had not only met but exceeded his expectations. When Samuel entered the gym the following morning, he was greeted with the kind of respect that he had earned through months of quiet determination. It wasn't just about the physical feats he had accomplished. It was about something deeper. It was the way he carried himself, the humility, the discipline, and the unwavering commitment to self-improvement. Samuel had become a role model not just for his strength, but for his integrity and consistency. The gym, once a place filled with young, self-assured athletes, had become a hub of learning and mentorship. Samuel's quiet influence had begun to change the atmosphere. No longer did it feel like a place for people to compete and outdo one another. Instead, it had transformed into a community of individuals committed to bettering themselves, each with their own unique goals, but all drawn to the same sense of discipline and persistence that Samuel had lived by. Jason, who had once been the gym's shining star, was now one of the many who sought out Samuel's wisdom. The shift in his perspective had been subtle at first. His form had improved, his consistency had deepened, but it wasn't until after the competition that Jason realized just how much he had learned from Samuel. He no longer measured his progress by how much weight he could lift. Instead, he focused on the journey, on the small improvements that added up over time. His approach to fitness had completely changed, and he had Samuel to thank for that. One morning, Jason approached Samuel with a question that had been weighing on his mind. "Samuel, I've been thinking a lot about what you said after the competition. You know, about not pushing to failure and instead focusing on consistency. But what happens when I hit a plateau? I've been lifting for a while now, and I feel like I'm not improving as fast as I used to. How do I push through that?" Samuel paused for a moment, considering the question carefully. It was one he had encountered many times in his own life. The truth was, plateaus were inevitable. There would always come a time when it felt like progress had slowed, when the body had adjusted to the routine, and the gains that had once come easily began to fade. But that was the moment when true growth began, not in the ease of progress, but in the persistence to keep going despite the stagnation. "Plateaus are part of the process, Jason," Samuel said, his voice calm and steady. "They aren't a sign that you've failed. They're a sign that you've reached a new level. You've conditioned your body to handle what it's been doing, and now it's time to challenge it in new ways. Change your routine. Focus on different muscle groups. Try new movements. But above all, be patient. Remember, growth isn't linear. It's not about always going up. Sometimes it's about resting, recovering, and then coming back stronger." Jason nodded, understanding now that progress wasn't just about pushing harder. It was about being mindful of the body's needs and taking the time to adjust when things started to plateau. Samuel's words had a profound effect on him, and he found himself experimenting with new training methods, paying more attention to recovery, and embracing the slower, more deliberate process of building long-term strength. The gym members, too, had started to follow Samuel's example. They no longer viewed fitness as a race, a contest to see who could lift the most or run the fastest. Instead, they approached their workouts with a sense of mindfulness, focusing on technique, form, and consistency. Many of the younger athletes, who had once been obsessed with lifting the heaviest weights, now took time to perfect their movements, to understand their bodies, and to prioritize rest and recovery. Over time, Samuel's influence spread beyond the walls of the gym. His story was shared, not just among the gym-goers, but with others in the community. He became known not just as the elderly man who could lift weights, but as a symbol of resilience, of strength in the face of aging. People began to reach out to him, asking for advice not just about fitness, but about life. They wanted to know how to stay motivated, how to overcome the challenges of growing older, how to keep pushing forward when everything seemed to be slowing down. Samuel had become a mentor, not just in fitness, but in life. He had lived through the ups and downs, the triumphs and the tragedies, and had come out the other side with a profound understanding of what it meant to persevere. His approach to fitness was merely a reflection of his approach to life. Steady, patient, consistent, and always with an eye toward improvement. One afternoon, a local newspaper reporter came to the gym to interview Samuel. They had heard about the 72-year-old man who had inspired an entire community and wanted to learn more about his story. As Samuel sat down for the interview, he was reminded of just how far he had come. Years ago, he never would have imagined that his journey in fitness would have such a profound impact on others. He had started out simply trying to improve himself, to prove to himself that age wasn't a barrier to strength. But now he realized that his journey had touched far more lives than he could have ever imagined. The reporter asked him, "What's the secret to your success? How have you been able to maintain this level of fitness well into your 70s?" Samuel smiled, his eyes thoughtful as he answered, "There's no secret. It's just about showing up, day after day, and doing the work. I've learned to respect my body, to listen to it, and to be patient with the process. It's about understanding that you're not in competition with anyone else. The only person you need to compete with is yourself. Every day, you should strive to be a little better than you were yesterday." The reporter nodded, clearly impressed. "And how do you keep yourself motivated?" Samuel thought for a moment, then replied, "Motivation is a funny thing. It comes and goes. Some days, you feel unstoppable, and other days, it feels like you're dragging your feet. But that's where discipline comes in. Motivation will get you started, but discipline will keep you going. You do the work even when you don't feel like it. That's the real test." After the interview, Samuel felt a quiet sense of pride. He had never sought recognition or fame, but now, it seemed that his story was resonating with others in ways he hadn't expected. People were inspired by his journey, not just because of his physical strength, but because of his inner strength. He had faced the inevitability of aging, of slowing down, but he had chosen to rise above it. He had chosen to remain active, to stay engaged, and to prove that it was never too late to be the best version of yourself. Weeks later, Samuel received an invitation to speak at a local community event, a gathering focused on wellness and longevity. The organizers had heard about his story and wanted him to share his journey with others. As he prepared for his speech, Samuel reflected on how far he had come. He had started this journey in the gym, simply wanting to regain his strength. But now, his story had evolved into something far more meaningful, a message of resilience, perseverance, and the power of the human spirit. When the day of the event arrived, Samuel stood before the crowd, the audience filled with people of all ages. He spoke from the heart, telling his story not as a man who had conquered physical feats, but as someone who had learned to face life's challenges head-on, without fear or hesitation. As we grow older, we're often told that we slow down, that we lose our strength. But I'm here to tell you that it's never too late to grow stronger, he said. The mind is a powerful thing. It's not about how fast you go or how much you lift. It's about showing up every day, doing the work, and believing that you can always get better. His words resonated deeply with the audience. Samuel wasn't just speaking about fitness, he was speaking about life. And in that moment, he realized that the legacy he had built wasn't just one of physical strength. It was a legacy of courage, of living life with intention, and of showing others that it was never too late to start. His journey had become a beacon of hope for anyone facing obstacles, reminding them that strength wasn't just physical. It was a way of living.